Welcome to plenary session number 2, using oversight tools to affect change and design legal reforms, featuring Elise Bean of the Levin Center. Elise graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Wesleyan University and earned a Juris Doctorate, cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School. After a clerkship with the Chief Judge of the U.S. Claims Court and a couple years at the U.S. Department of Justice, Elise accepted a position in the office of Senator Carl Levin of Michigan. And for nearly 30 years, Elise worked in the Senate, about half of which she worked in the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. After Senator Levin's retirement in 2015, Elise helped establish the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy, whose primary mission is to strengthen bipartisan oversight capacity in Congress and state legislatures. She currently serves as co-director of the Levin Center's Washington office. Please welcome Elise Bean.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank the conference for inviting me here today. So I worked for the Senate for actually 30 years for Senator Carl Levin, doing investigations. About 15 years of that on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which in the U.S. Senate is sort of the premier investigative body that investigates complex issues. I helped draft legislation based on investigations that we did. And I'm now part of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy in Detroit. It's named and is to honor the legacy of Senator Levin, who was really a giant in the U.S. Senate in terms of doing congressional oversight. My plan today is to talk about oversight and its relationship to drafting legislation, give a couple of examples of how oversight investigations led to laws, and offer some tips on how an investigation can translate into legislative provisions. So let's see if this works. There we go. What is oversight? So it is a fact-based investigation into a problem, essentially finding out what happened and why. You can use it to look at government actions by agencies. You can also look at the private sector to see if there are abuses that should be addressed with legislation. And we all know that legislation is better when it's informed by the facts. If you really want to solve a problem, you need to understand that problem, and oversight investigations can help you do that. Now, we've all watched hearings by legislative committees to talk about legislation. They talk about what a bill should say, who supports it, who opposes it. An oversight hearing is not like that. It's not about legislative solutions. It's about the problem. It's about the facts. It is setting the stage for whether legislation is needed. So, for example, if you have a legislative hearing on the Clean Air Act, you're going to talk about the bill. But if you have an oversight hearing, you're going to talk about dirty air. Where is it? What's causing it? How do we track it? How do we measure it? What are the health impacts? What technologies exist to address it? And is there a need for legislation, and why? So that's sort of the difference between an oversight hearing and a legislative hearing. So the legal basis for doing oversight is inherent in the legislative process. In the US Constitution, we don't have anything in our Constitution that spells out the right of Congress to do oversight investigations. But back in 1792, 3 years after we adopted our Constitution, there was a huge military defeat. The Congress wanted to investigate it. They passed legislation setting up an investigative body. They went to George Washington, our first president, who had his cabinet members, and they talked about it, and they said, yes, it is proper for this legislation to request documents from us and to do a factual inquiry. So that set the precedent for Congress doing investigations. It wasn't until 1927 that we actually had a Supreme Court decision laying out the right of Congress to do investigations. And I have one of the quotes from that case, McGreen versus Doherty: a legislative body cannot legislate wisely or effectively in the absence of information. 100 years later after that, we had a recent case in the Supreme Court, Trump versus Mazars, and they said a representative body is meant to be the eyes and the voice and to embody the wisdom and will of its constituents. It also supported the right of Congress to compel information. So that's the legal basis for doing these investigations. But why should you do them? What's the point? Well, there are a lot of points. First of all, you need to get the facts to have effective legislation. Maybe you want to hold people accountable when you're looking into what happened and why. What did so-and-so do? What did this person do? What did this corporation do? What did this agency do? You also might want to educate your fellow legislators, the executive branch, and the public about what happened and why. And that is one way to generate momentum for change. Ultimately, the point of legislative investigations is to affect change. It is problem solving. Of course, it's not always perfect. We've all seen the partisan food fights that go on, the political infighting, but I maintain that that's not the point of oversight. The point of oversight is to lay out the factual basis of a problem and think about whether legislation is appropriate. So this is a picture from one of the hearings that we held looking at Goldman Sachs and their role in the financial crisis in 2008. And I think, how one picture is worth 1,000 words. It tells you how an oversight investigation can generate interest and momentum for change. The subcommittee that I was on had no authority to pass the legislation. All we could do were oversight hearings. And yet, look at the impact that we had. Those are all those reporters. It was a perfect storm. We called it the Goldman vortex because everybody was so intent about what they did. There's also, for people who work in the legislature, I can tell you, deep satisfaction by laying out a problem and holding people accountable in the public sphere. It's just something that is part of the legislative process, and I would urge you to experience it because it's a lot of fun. I also want to explain the difference between a legislative inquiry and a prosecution. In the United States, the legislature can't arrest anybody. We can't throw anybody in jail. We can't impose a monetary fine on them. All we can do is lay out the facts and pass legislation. That might be legislation in particular laws. It might be devoting funding. Maybe we declare a military action. Maybe we sustain a nomination or strike down a nomination, but we're not prosecutors. So when we look at it, the purpose of a legislative inquiry is to change policy. The purpose of a prosecution is to punish crime, wrongdoing. Legislatures use reports and hearings. Prosecutors use trials and guilty pleas. But when you think about it, legislative inquiries can be as important or more important than criminal prosecutions. I give you the example of Watergate. People remember Watergate in the United States not because a bunch of people went to jail, although a bunch of people did. They remember it because the president resigned in disgrace, because we passed campaign finance reform, and we passed financial disclosure requirements and ethics requirements for our legislatures. So legislative inquiries can be extremely powerful if you use them. So who can investigate? Well, just about anybody in a legislature can if they want. You can have a standing committee do an inquiry. You could set up a special committee. A lot of legislatures set up special committees and give a 1 year to look at a particular problem. In the United States, that's how we operated until we set up a permanent subcommittee on investigations. That's where I worked, because we said, you know what? We need a group of people that know how to investigate, that know their authorities, and so they can, whatever you're interested in, this cadre of people could work on it. Also, individual legislators can and should investigate, because you're supposed to vote on stuff, you're supposed to understand problems, so you can do your own investigations. And in fact, we've had very dramatic investigations by individual legislators in the US Congress. It's also important to understand that there are various levels of oversight, from a very light touch routine inquiry to an in-depth investigation. So you can start off, you just call up an agency, you call up a corporation, hey, what happened here? Maybe you call up a journalist and say, what happened here? You could send letters asking written questions. You can conduct informal interviews. You can also go full bore, have depositions with sworn testimony, hearings, reports. So you want to have the amount of effort should be proportional to the importance of the problem and your available resources. Now, my subcommittee was very small. We never had more than 10 people on our staff, and yet we were able to do very important, complex investigations. They took a year, but we were able to do them with a very small number of people. It's also important to understand that even if you do light touch oversight with your office, you just make a few phone calls, your secret superpower is that people normally return your phone calls and they answer your letters. Not always, but a whole lot better than an average person in the public, a journalist. So you have a power as individuals, as staff members, as legislatures to find out what happened and why. And that will help to inform your legislation. Okay, when we talk about an oversight investigation, sort of an amorphous concept, nobody knows what you're talking about. So we try to break it down into 4 phases. The first one is fact-finding. You talk to people, you get documents, you do a site visit, you actually find out the facts. But that's only the first phase. The second phase is you got to write it up, because if you don't write it up, nobody's going to know what it is that you found. And so you can write it up in a report. You could do a memo. You could do a letter to somebody. There's all different ways. You can do case studies. There are all different ways, and I've used all of them to write up what you found. And again, if it's a lighter touch, more narrow investigation, a letter to an agency may be sufficient to take care of the problem. If it's something more complicated, the biggest report I ever did was 750 pages. It nearly killed me, but it was worth it. 10 years later, people are still reading that report. It was about the financial crisis, how the mortgage market works, and it plays an important educational role. So those reports from oversight investigations are also very important. So if you've written it up and people think it's important enough, you can have a hearing. And you saw that photograph when we had that Goldman Sachs hearing. The press likes hearings. The public are interested. They're often televised. So you can attract a lot of attention and momentum for change through a hearing. And then the fourth and final stage, which a lot of people forget about, is to do something about the problem you've uncovered. So part of an oversight investigation is not only finding out what happened and why, educating people through reports and hearings, but also doing something about the problem. Okay, so now I want to give you a couple of examples. First example, it has to do with big tobacco. This was a problem that a particular legislator named Henry Waxman just got a passion for. And he spent 25 years holding hearing after hearing after hearing to try to address the problem. Now, his first hearing was in 1982. He talked about cancer rates and studies that had just come out showing links between smoking and tobacco and health impacts. He had a hearing on how smokeless tobacco products, I'm talking chewing tobacco, things like that, snuff, cause throat cancer. Very factual. He had a hearing about how secondhand smoke caused health problems. So it's not just the smoker, but everybody around them. He had a hearing on nicotine. He showed that nicotine was the element in tobacco that caused addiction. He also showed that the tobacco companies were manipulating the levels of nicotine in cigarettes, and he showed how they had applied for patents for ways to double the levels of nicotine in cigarettes, all factual. He also showed how people who drank alcohol, they had rates of addiction of between 8 and 15%, but people who smoked tobacco had addiction rates of 75 to 90%. and it was due to nicotine. In 1994, he had his most famous hearing of these series of hearings. It's one that has become famous in the annals of oversight in Congress, where he called up the 7 CEOs of the leading cigarette companies in the United States, called them up there, laid out the facts, talked about how there were 400,000 deaths a year, think about that, from tobacco smoking, and talked about the addiction that was caused by the tobacco products. And he also talked about how the marketing from the CEO, from the companies, were targeting children as future consumers, going as low as kids were 7, 8 years old. It was really quite remarkable, the studies that they uncovered. The CEOs all denied everything. It's not addictive. We're not targeting children. It's just not true. So this oversight hearing produced a lot of information that people didn't know. By the way, those are the CEOs with their hands up, at the hearing. The product of this was a legislation all along the way. So one of the things that Waxman helped do was bring parties together, even though at the time tobacco was a very intense political issue. You had farmers whose economies, whose livelihood depended on, farming with tobacco products. You had manufacturing jobs, a lot of them that were based on cigarettes. You had campaign donations, let's be frank, from all these tobacco companies that were going to members of Congress. It was a very hot issue at the time. But these facts that he brought out were so powerful, so persuasive, so disturbing, that he was able to bring all the political factions together to address them. And he had little legislative victories along the way. So in 84, he got those health warnings on the side of the cigarette packets. In 86, he got health warnings for smokeless tobacco products. In 87 and 90, after he had his hearing on secondhand smoke, they were able to ban smoking on flights, first for 2-hour flights, then altogether. But the big one eluded him for many years until 2009, after his, so many hearings along the way, he finally convinced his colleagues to authorize the Food and Drug Administration to regulate the manufacturing, advertising, and sale of tobacco products. So that was a huge victory that really came from his oversight hearings, and the elements of it were directly linked to the problems that they had uncovered. But there was an even bigger impact than passing legislation to show you the power of oversight. These hearings not only produced legislation, but they affected how the public viewed tobacco. Smoking went from a way to look cool, all the movie stars with their cigarettes, to a dirty habit that was hazardous to your health. That was a huge shift against all of the marketing. And the number of people smoking has continued to drop. It went from 42% of American adults, 42% in 1965, to 15% today. And among young smokers, the rate is as low as 9%. Now, vaping is trying to bring it back up, but so far, smoking is still seen as a dirty and expensive habit in the United States. We also got a bunch of taxes. That's another kind of legislation. So that's my first example for you about how an oversight hearing can really affect what's going on. So let's do a second example. This one has more global impact, so maybe it will be of interest. So this investigation happened when we had 2 confidential informants, independent, unrelated to each other, walk through our doors at the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The first was an IT professional who had been hired by a bank in Liechtenstein called LGT. And you'll see the little crown there in the LGT logo. That's because it was owned by the royal family of Liechtenstein. And he had been hired to turn that bank and trust company into a paperless office. Well, along the way, he started reading the paper, and he was appalled at what he found. He found corrupt officials, drug, criminals, organized crime, bunch of tax evaders, all had accounts at LGT. So he finished his project, the project for them. He got paid, but he took a copy of all the paper with him. And then he systematically went to over a dozen countries and said, for example, he went to Germany and said, I have a whole bunch of accounts opened by your nationals, and I'm willing to give it to you if you pay me. And Germany paid him $5 million. Of course, this was against the law in Liechtenstein. He stole the information. They put a bounty on his head, $7 million. He had to disappear from view. But meanwhile, he had decided as one of the countries he would visit is he would go to the United States and talk to the IRS. Now, the IRS won't pay you up front, but if you give them information and they later collect a bunch of tax, they'll pay you a percentage of it. So he came to the United States, and the lawyer he used when he went to talk to the IRS knew about my subcommittee and said, the IRS, even if they do everything you want, nobody's ever going to hear about it. Go to the Senate subcommittee and maybe they'll make it public. So he came to us and he gave us a bunch of documents for free. We had no money. He gave it to us with no strings attached. And they were a stack of documents about 150 US citizens who had accounts at LGT. So, for example, one of them was this guy from Florida. He was a contractor. His name was Marsh. And he had been putting money into this Liechtenstein account in secret for years. He was up to about $49 million, I think it was. And that was all set out in these documents. Now, one of our problems was all the documents were in Liechtenstein German. I asked in the office, anybody take German in college? We had 2 people who were able to go through these accounts and pick out the ones with the most money and sort of the most interesting facts. So we picked out about 24 of them and investigated them. Everyone we investigated, they had already been contacted by the IRS, so we were just sort of the latest shoe to drop. And we were able to talk to them about what happened. Some admitted it, some didn't. In the case of the guy from Florida, Mr. Marsh, his kids denied that they knew anything about this account. He had recently died, and they were, surprised to find out about this account. The problem with it is we had internal memos from LGT where they came out to Liechtenstein and signed a bunch of papers and directed how the money should be invested. These kids, by the way, were in their 50s, so we had all of those very interesting facts, and we developed more facts about all kinds of secrecy tricks that LGT was using. They would use payphones to call people in the states. They would have, just a whole bunch of things. They would set up shell companies and open up the accounts in them. You can imagine all the stuff that went on. 4 months after we heard from the first confidential informant, a second person walked through our door, and he was a former private banker from UBS, a Swiss bank, then pretty much the largest in the world. And he had been fired by them and decided to go to the IRS with his story. And his lawyer also sent him to our subcommittee. And he said, you know what? I have a really good story to tell you if you'll give me a friendly subpoena, so I'll be compelled to tell you. Sure, we'll give you a friendly subpoena. So he gave us a whole story about how bankers from this Swiss bank would secretly come to the United States. They would go to yachting events, expensive art sales, things like that. And they would hand out their cards to all the rich people at these events and tell them, if you'd like to open up an account in Switzerland, you can do that, and it's very confidential. Well, they had been doing this for years, and they had actually, he said, and to make a long story short, it turned out they had 50,000 accounts with $18 billion that had never been declared to the IRS, even though UBS had an agreement with the IRS that they would disclose accounts held by US citizens. So now we had LGT with specific great facts about what some US citizens were doing to hide their assets and evade paying taxes. And then with UBS, we had the big numbers, 50,000, $18 billion. I mean, that was a lot of money. It's not 150 people, it's 50,000 people. So we ended up having a hearing in 2008. Now, we told UBS, you have a big footprint in the United States, but you guys aren't doing this. It's all your colleagues back in Switzerland. You really ought to send us somebody from Switzerland. We can't compel them. We can only subpoena people here in the US, and we will subpoena you, but you really should send us somebody who actually knows what happened. So UBS sent, somewhat to our surprise, a senior official from Switzerland. He looked like James Bond. He had the perfect hair, the $2,000 suit. We had no idea what he would say, and he was our last witness. And when he sat down, he apologized for what the bank had been doing and said they were taking responsibility for it and they were going to stop these practices and they would never, they were sorry. Well, we were so astounded. I passed Senator Levin a little note. Wow. Just gave him, of course, we're on the TV. And he took a big stack of very tough questions, put them to the side, and he said, what exactly are you sorry for? And what exactly is it that you're not going to do anymore? And they admitted that they had been helping US clients to open up secret accounts and cheat on their taxes. Now, the reason they made this admission publicly was not because of us, or not only because of us, but because the US Department of Justice was just about to indict them. They ended up having a deferred prosecution agreement where they paid $780 million and disclosed the names of over 4,000 clients to the IRS. All right, earthquake in the offshore world. The biggest, most powerful bank rats out their clients, breaks Swiss secrecy, and tells the Department of Justice what was going on. That was a big deal. But that wasn't legislative. That was all the prosecutors and the executive branch. There were also important legislative repercussions from this investigation. The most important is that we had a committee pass something called the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. I call it FATCA, sort of fat cat without the T. And what it said, this was put together by the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, because again, our subcommittee had no legislative jurisdiction. But what it said is every non-US financial institution around the world, if you open up an account for a US person, you have to tell us. And if you don't, and if we find out, we're going to slap a 30% excise tax on your earnings, financial institutions that come from the United States. Financial institutions almost all have US treasuries or US stock. So this was no idle threat. We could grab that money before it left our borders. So this legislation was introduced. There was one quick hearing on it. That's that legislative hearing instead of our oversight hearings. And 5 months later, it was enacted into law. Excuse me, what happened to our dysfunctional Congress? I mean, how is that even possible that they would pass this worldwide, impact bill in 5 months with one little hearing? Well, one of the reasons is because the US banking industry was sick and tired of all their richest clients going to foreign banks to open up secret accounts. So they wanted that bill. And the Finance Committee and Ways and Means bills, they listened to the banking industry. So they passed that legislation. When it became law, a lot of non-US banks are like, excuse me, what? What are you talking about? They tried to stop it, but it was too late. It had become law, and the committees were not willing to take it back, nor were the legislators, because of the banking industry's support. So as I catch up on my little notes here, it was really fairly astounding legislation that was really the product of our oversight hearings. But it doesn't end there. The rest of the world was mad. They're like, you're making our financial institutions set up this infrastructure to report these accounts to the US. It actually took 6 years to happen. But they also said, you know what, US? Your banks have secret accounts for our nationals. What about that? And the US said, you know what, you're right. And they passed a regulation requiring all US financial institutions for the first time to report to the IRS not only accounts opened by US persons, but accounts opened by non-US persons. And they began to set up a system to trade this information. But then the rest of the world said, forget about the US. What about all of us? The Germans who had accounts in Liechtenstein. The Italians have secret accounts in Switzerland. And vice versa. They set up their own FATCA-style system to have common reporting standards to disclose these accounts to everybody's government. Over 100 countries signed up, and disclosures actually began in 2017, not that long ago. So Senator Levin's little hearing on tax cheating in the United States ended up having not only a national impact, but an international impact. And today we have a lot more transparency about bank accounts than we used to. Now, that doesn't mean that the system is perfect. Of course, it's not. We've had oversight hearings since showing all of the flaws in what we set up and how it should be improved further. And that's clearly true to me for a lot of reasons, but we'll leave that aside. But that's my second example for you to show you how oversight can influence legislation and should do it. I want to offer to you a way of thinking about good oversight. There's no formal way to do it. There's no accepted way to do it, but we considered 4 different factors. First of all, we would look at the quality of the investigation. Did you ask the questions you should have? Did you talk to the people you should have? Did you get the documents that you needed to? Did you really understand what happened? So that's first, the quality of the investigation. Second of all, we wanted to look at, did you go beyond one particular party? Did you get buy-in from other people? Were they persuaded by your facts? Because in the United States, believe it or not, you're much more likely to get legislation if there's bipartisan support than if only one party supports it. We also looked at the credibility of the inquiry from third parties. Did your colleagues think it was good? Did the experts? How about the media? How about the public? Was it seen as a credible investigation? But it can be high quality, bipartisan or multi-party support, very credible, but if you don't change policy, if you don't have an impact on policy, from our way of thinking, that is not good oversight or not good enough. So I just want to offer you that set of standards to think about what's good oversight. So now I want to take a few minutes to talk about how you actually use oversight to design legislation. So one of the things, you have to think about how you are going to use oversight. One of the things is to identify and understand particular problems. There are a lot of problems that don't require legislation. Alternatives are you get somebody fired, or you get somebody hired, or you get an agency to do a rulemaking, or to just change its practice, or maybe you get a corporation to just stop doing what they were doing and do something else. You don't have to have legislation in order for oversight to be successful. But some problems require legislation, and you want to identify those and you want to think about them deeply, because you don't want to go through all of the hassle, as we all know, of passing legislation and then have it not make any difference, to be ineffective. And that's one of the ways that oversight can be helpful to you, is to help you design effective legislation. The other thing is you don't want to reinvent the wheel, for goodness sake. So you want to research what other countries have done. You want to look at what the states have done, for example. Sometimes they have very good practices that we should think about. So you want to do that research. You now have legislators who are involved in that oversight legislation. You have automatic allies who understand what the problem is, and they also want to make change. So you want to consult with them and find out what are their ideas about how to fix things. And of course, you want to consult with experts, agencies, outside groups, all the people who've been following your oversight, maybe even testified for you. And so you get the benefit of their expertise. And again, that oversight investigation has created a funnel for you to get that group of people who care about that problem and get them talking to you and to each other. And what you finally want to do is have a brainstorm. Have people sit around a table to think about how can we tackle this problem in a way that's feasible and effective. Because maybe you can't do the whole problem, as Henry Waxman found out. Maybe you can only get a health warning on the side of a cigarette package, but that helped and it built momentum over time. Maybe you can get that big bill that really fixes a lot of the problem. So you want to have a brainstorm about possible options. You have to think about who's in that brainstorm. Maybe you have a couple different ones, because you don't want to build up expectations for your allies outside of the legislature that, yeah, hey, we're going to get this done right away. All of these things take years or at least that's been my experience. They take years to actually fix. So those are things that how you can use that oversight information, the facts, the people involved, the allies, to use their expertise and their support to try to design legislation. And I would say the end result of that brainstorm is you would come up with maybe 3 different options. You present them to your boss and see what they like and what they think is possible. Now, you can also think about, not all oversight is monumental. Sometimes you're looking at a particular issue and you want to consider very narrow remedies. So for example, we did an investigation looking at Great Lakes sites that had a lot of pollution and toxins. There was a law that they were supposed to be cleaned up, but they never were, surprise, surprise. So we passed a legislation that simply set a deadline for that existing law to be complied with. Again, they ignored our deadline, but we did get a lot of action out of them and we moved the process forward. You can think about assigning duties to specific officials, because if you have a problem and nobody's in charge of fixing it, it's very hard to hold anybody accountable. So for example, in the smoking issue, they decided to identify the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. You're the ones that we want to fix this problem. Now we can hold you accountable to it. So you might have a law that just identifies who is responsible. Of course, extra funding and resources, all those appropriations bills, that can be key to addressing a particular problem. And you can also take narrow remedies to just strengthen oversight. You find a lot of corruption in a particular field, maybe you create an IG, or maybe you take that existing IG and require them to do a series of 5 reports over 5 years to try to look at that problem. Maybe you require an agency to do a report. Maybe you have an auditor and you require them to do the report. So there are a lot of narrow remedies that may be all you can accomplish, but are still worth doing. And again, if you get an auditor in place, they put out reports, that's fodder for new hearings to build momentum for greater change. So you should think about that. But sometimes you want that big bill to really fix the problem. And that's where oversight, again, can help. It can help you reach across political divides to people who agree with you about the problem. And if you've involved them in your investigation, you can create allies that are unexpected. You can find allies among the people who testify, the experts, the academics, the trade groups, the civil society groups. You can start to build an alliance through your oversight investigation. You can draft materials using evidence from your oversight inquiry. You've got facts, hopefully powerful facts, that will help inspire change. And of course, you can design an initial bill and run it by those people in that alliance, because believe me, they're not gonna, if you're gonna get anything done, you're gonna have an alliance with people who don't completely agree with each other, and you're gonna have to negotiate it, and you're gonna have to think about compromises and find a way forward. The important thing is that oversight documents the problem you want to solve. And if you do it, you can do it quickly. It may be a pretty easy problem, but if it's a complicated problem, you can really go deep and try to understand what's really going on and how you can fix it. In our case of FATCA, that is something we never even dreamed of, but somebody else looked at our facts and came up with it, and pretty amazing solution to things that we had identified. Oversight can also show why change is needed and explain that to journalists, to civil society groups, to agencies, to colleagues on the legislature, to the public. Oversight can perform that function. You can also get publicity from your hearings and reports to try to get public attention to a problem that's been ignored. You can actually magnify that during or after your oversight investigation by yourself, coming to conferences, doing speeches, op-eds. There are ways to magnify that problem, talking to journalists, trying to inspire journalists to do their own investigations. And you can try to generate articles and other kinds of attention from the public. So that's my story. And I just hope I've convinced you that oversight inquiries can establish facts. They can bridge political divides. if you approach those facts in an honest way, they can create momentum for change, and they can produce not only legislation, but legislations that is effective and worth all the effort that you put into it. So thank you very much. I have a little slide here with more information. The Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy has a lot of materials on the website about how you can do better oversight. We have little videos, 5 and 10 minutes long, about how do you do a good document request? How do you do a good deposition? How do you handle obnoxious opposing counsel? We've also got all kinds of other kinds of materials that you can look at, and I hope it will be helpful to you. So I'm going to take some questions, but I think you wanted to make an announcement.
Yes, the second code for today is N as in Nancy, M as in Mary, the number 7, the number 3. If you're in person and seeking CLE credit, please write this down. If you're virtual and seeking CLE credit, please write this down. N as in Nancy, M as in Mary, the number 7, the number 3. And one final time, N as in Nancy, M as in Mary, the number 7, the number 3. And we also have a couple virtual questions. Matt, do you want us to go to those now, or?
Sure, let's take a virtual question.
Okay. So the first question is from Corrine. Joining you today from Canada, our legislative committees all have a dual investigative and legislative function. They are generally staffed by 2 to 3 nonpartisan experts who are public servants. How does partisanship shape investigations?
Well, you know, we've all seen on TV the hearings where one side says this is the truth and the other side says it's not the truth. And it can devolve into a very confusing situation where nobody knows what to think. I would call that bad oversight. It happens all the time, but we also see examples of good oversight. I would give you the example of the January 6th committee, where you had people from both sides of the aisle investigating together and really going after the facts. Now, some people say, oh, that January 6th committee, it wasn't really fair because you didn't have anybody on it that opposed those facts. Well, I don't think you have to have oversight with people who are not interested in the facts. I mean, one of the things you need for good oversight is a willingness on all sides to go where the facts lead you. So partisanship can go a lot of different ways. I think it's very important not to investigate with people who agree with you. You're investigating in an echo chamber. You don't challenge each other. The best investigations, and all of the ones that we did in the US Senate, are ones where you investigate with people who have a fundamentally different world view. They think about different facts, they think about different issues, they interpret the facts differently, and you need a meeting of the mind if you want to come up with results that are thoughtful, credible, and they have a chance of producing change. So I welcomed working with my I'm a Democrat, I welcomed working with my Republican colleagues. They acted in good faith. We didn't always agree. It was a very painful process at some point, but you know, that's known as being adults and trying to find a meeting of the mind where you can. And if you're trying to reach agreement on facts, there are ways to do that. Ways you can do, interviews, document requests. We have on our website some information about how you build factual consensus within an oversight investigation. I will also tell you there are a lot of investigations in the US Congress that go on today and all the time that have bipartisan support, but you don't hear about them. I say to my journalist colleagues, hey, are you going to cover this hearing? It's on a really interesting topic and both sides are into it. And they're like, both sides are into it. That's boring. No, I'm not going. They only want to cover the hearings where everybody's yelling at each other. I don't think that's helpful for our democracy, but that's the way it is today. So I hope I will make you happy to know that there is a lot of bipartisan oversight that still goes on in Congress today, leading to solutions. Another question, please.
And we have a second one virtually, and then we're done virtually and can go to the in-person. This is from Janine, and she asks, Are there concerns about whether committees in the House and Congress have sufficient staff and resources to investigate effectively? In some legislatures, committees suffer from a lack of resourcing and staffing to conduct really effective oversight. So resources to do that effectively.
So there aren't sufficient resources and personnel in Congress to do the kinds of oversight we ought to. At the same time, it is amazing to me what a handful of people can accomplish with no additional funding other than their regular salaries. That was the case on our subcommittee. We investigated the financial crisis. It took us 2 years. We conducted hundreds of interviews. We wrote this very long report. We had 4 blockbuster hearings. And, you know, we had a bunch of freebies, I call them. We had details, we had interns, we had law clerks. We made use of other kinds of free labor, but we were able to do very important investigations with a very small staff and very limited resources. Now, of course, to do a really good investigation, you need money, you need time, you need personnel, but probably the most important thing you need of all is you need the legislatures that you're working for to buy in, the particular leaders you're working with to come to an agreement and say, okay, we're going to do this together, we're going to follow the facts, and we're going to see what comes out. Now, Senator Levin, during his time, 15 years on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, had 4 different Republican partners. They kept getting elevated to the full committee from our subcommittee. But each time people said, you're never going to be able to work with that person. And each time we were able to work with that person because they were interested in the facts. And you find that many people in political life, they really are interested in the facts and they really do want to solve problems. And you also find that oversight can be a lot more fun than legislation because laying out a problem can lead to solutions even without legislation. And you can set the stage for legislation as well. And it can be deeply satisfying to you to do a really good oversight investigation that lays out a problem in all of its facts and sets the stage for people to address it.
Do we have a question from the audience?
Just hold it close.
Please announce your name and where you're from.
Hugh Brady, Austin, Texas. The question I have is, I thought you did it was a good job of talking about oversight of like third parties, but I'm wondering if you have some insight into investigating the executive branch. It seems like a lot of tools that the Congress has set up for itself have sort of been thwarted in the last few years, and I wondered if you could address that briefly.
You are absolutely correct. When I started off in oversight, if you asked an agency for information, they gave it to you, and you didn't need a subpoena to do it. Today, many agencies simply will not respond. And if you have to take them to court, it's a 2-year battle to get that information. So we have had, from both Democrats and Republicans, a growing reluctance to cooperate with congressional oversight. And that's a problem because you have to spend a lot of your resources dealing with that. But there are ways to deal with it. And again, on our website, we have a little handout that you can think about it. Our general principle is you want to make it more in their interest to cooperate with you than to fight with you. So for example, you call in the legislative liaison, you have a 2-hour come to Jesus meeting about why they're not cooperating. You bring in a higher agency official. You have Senator Levin call the head of the agency. Why haven't you given me this information? If you have to, you hold a hearing simply on the issue of how they're not cooperating with your information. Maybe you go after him in another hearing, their appropriations hearing. Well, you're asking for more money, but you haven't given us X, Y, Z. Maybe there's something else that they want that you can stop from going forward, or something that you want you can help them with if they produce certain documents to you by a certain time. All of these things take time. If you're trying to do your investigation in a month, you're out of luck. But if you got a whole year, one of the things that we did, this is not an agency, it's a corporation, but we're going after Goldman Sachs. They gave us nothing. Senator Levin had us call in the CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, for an all-day deposition. Turned out he had never been deposed before. And we said, you know, usually we don't ask for information until we have documents, and we usually start at the bottom and work our way up. You want to start at the top with no documents. Senator Levin said, you bring him in and you ask him everything you want to know. So we did. They first asked if they could bring in 24 lawyers with them. We said no. We did allow them 8 chairs, but not 24. It's good fit in our conference room. And we went through that exercise, and he was under oath, and it was all transcribed. At the end of it, we said in front of him and to his lawyers, now we're going to go to the president of Goldman Sachs. We're going to go through your entire C-suite, unless perhaps you have some information you'd like to give us, and then we wouldn't have to do necessarily all of these interviews at this point in time. Well, guess what? 2 weeks later, they went from giving us nothing to giving us, actually, I think it was 5 million or 10 million pages of documents. So we went from, nothing to overwhelming us. We called it the ocean. We set up special hard drives. We had 20 people, half of whom were college students. And we said, okay, we're going to go swimming in the ocean every day for the next 3 months. And we're going to see what we can find. And we had a plan. We had a dirty word search. That's always our first search. Damn, hell, all those things. You get really good emails from that. You have certain things you want at certain people. You look for that person who wants to be cool on email and says all the things they shouldn't. And even if they are not central to the thing, their emails are always really, you just got to find that person. Particular hearing meetings they might have, or particular CEOs and the same thing is true for agencies. You can eventually get them to cough up the information, but it may take several months because agencies don't have a lot of money and they often don't have very good systems for producing email or memos or things like that. So you are right that investigating agencies used to be easier, but now it's more difficult than investigating the private sector. But we were able to get it done. For example, in that financial crisis investigation, when we not only looked at Goldman Sachs, but we looked at the Office of Thrift Supervision and why they fell down on the job, and found out all these things where they were calling their credit unions that they were supposed to be regulating as their constituents, found out that their budget was reliant on fees paid by these credit unions. Excuse me, they weren't credit unions, they were thrifts. And eventually we exposed all of this at a hearing, and what never happens in Washington is we abolished that agency. That's oversight. That's what you can do.
Makes you think twice what you put in an email, right?
You should.
All right. Another question?
Good morning. My name is Flavio from Brazil, and thanks for this great explanation. You said that the product of this legislative inquiry is a written document, hearings, and follow-up. And I suppose that these phases are full of relevant arguments about the facts investigated, ethical arguments, pragmatic arguments, teleological arguments, etc. And that the result of these investigations can be the enactment of a new law or the reform of an existing law. My question is, do the judges take these arguments seriously when they have to decide a case related with these laws?
Yes, is the answer, if you do a good job. If you do a junky, poor quality oversight investigation, no court cares about it. But because ours were chock full of facts, and what we tended to do, like that financial crisis investigation, we actually had 1 volume of our hearing report and documents, and then we had 4 more volumes that consisted just of documents, saying that don't trust us. You can verify what we're saying by looking at the documents yourself. And we would put those out into the public domain. When you do something like that, we have on many occasions had people submit our reports or hearing records as part of litigation or prosecution. We've had people from our subcommittee, they're not allowed to lie to Congress, have sometimes testified at criminal proceedings. In almost all of the investigations we've done, there's been a parallel law enforcement investigation by Department of Justice, by the SEC, by the FTC, civil and criminal banking regulators. And while sometimes they try to say, you shouldn't do your oversight, wait till we're done, we never accepted that because we knew they didn't have the time like we had. If we had 10 people that could spend 1 year on this particular project, we were going to find a lot of information that would be helpful to them. And in 30 years of investigations, I found we were only helpful. We never hurt any enforcement project going on at the same time. At the same time, constitutionally, Congress is not allowed to be doing criminal prosecutions or civil prosecutions to help the executive branch. We have to be doing it for our own legislative purposes. And we were very careful about that. And the January 6th committee, you may have noticed, they said, no, we're not giving you our interviews. We're not doing this for you, Department of Justice. We're doing it because we want to find out what happened and think about legislative responses to it. But as we're coming to a close, then the Department of Justice can ask for information, and I imagine that they will be very cooperative. And as they've made things public, the prosecutors, guess what? They look at it. And, we had prosecutors sitting in our audience during all of our hearings as well. So we can have that sort of interaction with them. But again, one of the things I've found is that oversight is not as active or popular around the world as I wish it were. People in the EU, there's a lot of oversight going on. UK does a lot of oversight. But in Latin America, in Africa, there aren't the same kind of oversight hearings. Some people say because the legislature doesn't have the will to sort of oppose the executive branch if they're in the same party. We have some of those issues here too. But even so, there are lots of things that are not really political. My hospital doesn't operate very well. Can I look at those problems, identify them, think about how we could help address them? It's not really a political issue. Maybe you have Ticketmaster, somebody who's controlling tickets to all of the good, things concerts you want to go to, and they're charging astronomical fees. Well, you can go after that on both sides from any party to help your constituents without necessarily, now you may have to have something that you instruct an agency to exercise oversight. So you're going to the government to help you address the problem. But there's a lot of ways that there are a lot of things you can look at that any legislature can look at in response to the concerns of their constituents. We did an investigation on unfair credit card practices. We helped 100 million, account holders by just forcing the credit card companies to be more fair. And we also set up a system for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to try to continue that effort to look at credit card provisions and make sure that we don't have, talking about junk fees right now, unfair fees imposed by banks or credit cards. I mean, that's the kind of stuff, if you're in the legislature, sort of get it going and then see where it goes from there.
I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately. Elise, thank you so much for your presentation. It's fascinating. I'm sure that people from around the world will think about how they can better use oversight tools to help them develop their legislation